instrument of torture. Welcome to the River Liffey, folks. Welcome to Dublin city centre. We will have the river all to ourselves because nobody travels this way. It's too slow. It's much quicker to travel by road. Not in Dublin, it bloody isn't, but there you go. 1200 years ago, the Vikings sailed into Dublin Bay and they founded modern Dublin. They found the biggest river flowing into the bay, sailed up it, and began the creation of one of the first towns in Ireland, because before the Vikings came here, the Irish didn't live in towns. They lived scattered across the countryside, farming parcels of land in a country that was otherwise 90% covered in trees and forest. So the first towns in Ireland were all built by the Vikings along either the east or the south coast, not the west coast, because that's a whole different kettle of fish, folks. 1200 years ago it was, still is. Hence Ireland, relatively straight along the south and east coast, but the west coast, just like Scotland, very, very broken and battered by the North Atlantic Ocean. So Dublin is 1200 years old, and the last time Dublin had an economic boom like it kind of having at the moment was the second half of the 18th century, the Georgian era. And most of the great public buildings in Dublin are from that time, including the one coming up on your right, Dublin's favourite building, the Customs House. Or if you live in Germany, you'd call this the Zollhaus. This is where every boat using the port had to pay a tax. The old Customs House was too small, too far up the river. Because by the late 18th century, Dublin was part of a rapidly expanding British Empire. And boats were coming in from all over the world with all sorts of new exotic goods like tea and coffee and sugar, sort of stuff we take for granted today. But merchants were selling it. Many of them had a monopoly, many of them were making fortunes. That's our favourite building. And it was designed by a man called James Gandon, who, interestingly enough, we now know could not read or write. Apparently he had a condition called dyslexia. But that's why he was able to study architecture, because it's all drawings and scale. The building's loaded with symbolism, including at the top the Lady of Commerce, trade, enterprise, bringing wealth and prosperity. And at each end of the building, a lion, a unicorn and a harp. They represent England, Scotland and Ireland, three countries that through history have always got on well on together. It's never been an ounce of trouble between England and Scotland or England or Ireland. That's the railway bridge we're going under from the late 19th century. The railway was built along the lovely Dublin Bay. The rich moved out of the city and lived in the first suburbs and would catch the train in and out of work every day. On the right, another award-winning building from the 1960s, Liberty Hall, the trade union headquarters. Customs House is voted the prettiest building in Dublin every year. Liberty Hall is voted the ugliest. Yeah. This is classic Dublin. Let's stick a butt-ugly building right beside the prettiest building in the city. Any city that was heavily bombed in World War II will have a lot of architecture like that from the 60s and 70s, when architects took the same drugs as rock stars, which isn't really a great idea. Dublin is kind of lucky because it escaped pretty lightly in the war, and that's why it doesn't have any high-rise buildings as such. So if you go to Guinness, the gravity bar 7 stories up will give you a panoramic view of the whole city. The rule before the Second World War was that no building in any city should be taller than the spire of the cathedral or the main church. There you go. We still have that rule. So today we have the river all to ourselves. The last commercial boats to use the river used to tie up over there on your left-hand side, and they worked for a company called Guinness. And they sent the beer over to Britain in a ship called the Lady Miranda. Next bridge is the biggest on the river. It's named after a great 19th century statesman called Daniel O'Connell. You can see him out there now to the right. Nearly always has a seagull on his head. Has he got a seagull on his head? For once. Ah, there they are, just on time. That's why the poor man has white hair. So there's an O'Connell Street in pretty well every major town or city in Ireland. This is one of the few bridges in the world which is wider than it is long. This is where it's going to get dark, folks. By 4 meters or 14 feet, the bridge is wider than it is long. I'm often asked, why is the bridge wider than it is long? I I always say that's a very good question. It is, it's a very good question. I haven't got a clue what the answer is, but it's a very good question. This is the modern city centre of Dublin, including the area on the left called Temple Bar. It should be spelled B-A-R-R. It was a bar or barrier of land above the old river, given to a man called William Temple. He came here around the year 1600 to be the first governor, provost of the newly founded Trinity College, which is 5 minutes walk off to the left-hand side. The river was walled in, a huge engineering project that went on for about 200 years, all the way from here down to the sea. Walled in, modelled on a city in Europe called Paris. Walled in, and the line of open streets by the river called Quays, Q-U-A-Y-S. Didn't matter if you were very, very rich, you were not allowed to build your house and garden right on top of the river. That's why Dublin has a nice open riverfront. And for the year 2000, we added the Millennium Boardwalk, so you can sit out on the north bank of the river and enjoy Dublin's lovely sunny Mediterranean climate at least 10 days every year. Now, if the city is, or at least the river, is walled in, according to, or following on from Paris, the next bridge is the most famous, Halfpenny Bridge of 1816, which is designed to remind you of a city in Italy, which just happens to be my favourite city in the whole wide world. And all going well, I will be there in a few weeks' time, because I only ever go there in the winter. The city, if you haven't already guessed, is La Repubblica Serenissima di Venezia. Allora, the most serene Republic of Venice, which just happens to be my favourite city in the whole wide world. I have a love affair with Venice. Interestingly enough, the colours of the city of Venice are green and gold, the same colours as you get in the Irish national flag. Verdi ora, ai colori vivo. Yes. Now, the next bridge is called the Millennium Bridge. It was opened on Christmas Eve 1999. Something very important happening in Ireland, folks. The population's going up. Because for 150 years, the population either went down or was stagnant after the 1840s famine. Now it's going up. It's gone up 50% in the last 30 years. Everyone in Ireland knows the population's going up, except from one small little group. They're called the planners. It appears to have sailed clean over their head that the population's going up, and you might not need to buy, or might like to build, a few more houses and apartments and schools and hospitals and power stations and reservoirs. It's very complicated stuff, folks. Take a break, have a pay rise, drink a cup of coffee, but when you're ready, would you do some planning? It would be good. Don't get me started. Over there on the left is a tunnel, and through that tunnel flows a river called the Poddle, and the Poddle meets the Liffey, and that is where Dublin's name comes from. Because if you look at the walls, you'll see seaweed. This river is tidal for another couple of miles or kilometres inland. You can't drink salt water, folks, it'll make you violently sick. So the Vikings got their fresh drinking water from the Poddle. Where the Poddle meets the Liffey was called Dublin, and that became Dublin. If it was translated properly, the capital of Ireland would not be Dublin, it would be called Blackpool, because that's what it means. And if Glyndŵr was translated from the Welsh, the capital of the UK next door would not be called London, it would be called Blackpool, because it means exactly the same thing. So this is as far inland as we go. The centre of the Viking town was a little further to the left, inland, up on top of a hill, and if you go up there beside Christ Church Cathedral today, you will still see street names that go back to those times: High Street, Haymarket, Cornmarket, Wine Tavern Street, and so on. But when the Customs House opened in 1791, it pulled the city east along the river about 1.5 miles, about 2.5 kilometres, because wherever the Customs House was, that's where all the business was, folks, because in the 1790s, the only way to come into Ireland was in a boat. So all the sailors jumping off after weeks and months at sea, money in their pocket to spend, that was the centre of commercial activity. So the city moved. You will see that in many old cities. If you travel around Europe, you'll often see signs for Altstadt and Neustadt, Old Town and New Town. Well, Dublin's exactly the same. The New Town was the Georgian 18th century town. Just to point out, folks, that I am slightly worried because nobody is using a notebook. I had a 12-year-old girl on a tour yesterday and she had a notebook. I said, why have you got a notebook, Camille? And she said, in case there's an exam. Well, folks, there is an exam, and they didn't tell you. Sure, they didn't know. They never tell you, but there's a 50-question exam at the end of this tour, just to make sure you're listening to every word I say. I'm always fascinated by the kids with the notebooks. I really should take a note of their name and run it forward about 15 or 20 years, because I guarantee they'll be the chief executives of the biggest companies in Ireland. And a great one years ago, I used to do a bit of sports coaching. And we had an 11-year-old kid who was tackled. He went flying in the air, he put his hand out and he broke his arm. So while we were waiting for the ambulance to take him to hospital, he asked for a notebook and pen. And I said, what the hell do you want a notebook and pen for? And he says, well, I won't be able to use that arm for 6 weeks, so I better learn to write with the other one. That's pretty damn clever for an 11-year-old. So Dublin is divided north side and south side. The north side out to the left is generally, well, if you're looking for a bargain, good luck in Dublin, but if you're going to get one, you're probably more likely to get it over on the north side. Henry Street is the main shopping street. South side is the more cultured, sophisticated, educated side. If you haven't already guessed, that's where I come from. Interestingly, a few years ago, the scientists and students of Trinity College Marine Department announced that out in Dublin Bay, the seals have subdivided into two groups. There's a group of north side seals and a group of south side seals, and they don't like each other either. They fight when they meet in the middle of the bay, apparently. But when the boardwalk was announced as a Millennium Year project for the year 2000, a lot of people said nobody will want to sit by the river because it is somewhat malodorous. Well, that's what we said on the south side. On the north side, they said the river is smelly and polluted, which it kind of was. And they figured out who the biggest polluter was. It was a company about 2 miles inland from here called Guinness. So they cleaned up their act, and now you can catch trout and salmon in the river. And if you want, as you can see on the left, you can go kayaking as well, up and down the river. If you're ever going to go kayaking, folks, try and time it to go nearer the high rather than the low tide, because it increases your visibility. Up there on the left, heading off to Bangladesh in the next couple of days, the lad selling coffee is called Nazir. He's been here about 20 years and he's paid for 15 people back home to get themselves a full second level education. Whenever I stop by and grab a coffee, we have a chat about the great sport of cricket. Here's where we get dark again. All this part of the city had to be completely rebuilt. Easter time 1916, there was a rebellion based up at the post office on O'Connell Street against British rule. It appeared to be a complete failure, and the rebels surrendered after a week's fighting. But 5.5 years later, Britain, effectively bankrupt after World War I, allowed most of Ireland its independence. And we are now just going into our second century of independence. Today, the average person in Ireland is about 20% better off than the average person in the UK. It's funny history. The tide comes in and then the tide goes back out again if you wait long enough. Over there on the left behind the Green Building, the Abbey Theatre, the National Theatre of Ireland. Dublin, still proud of the fact that it's the only city in the world that's produced 3 winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature. One of them, William Butler Yeats, helped found that theatre. And And if you're into reading, and by God I hope you are, folks, because when we stop reading, that will be the end of civilization as we know it, as far as I'm concerned. Recent well-known writers from Dublin include Roddy Doyle and a lady called Maeve Binchy. Maeve Binchy, I was a huge fan of hers, because what she used to do is go to cafes and sit and earwig on other people's conversations for hours, and that's where she got her idea for most of her books. That was back in the days when people used to talk to each other. I'm showing my middle age now, folks. I used to do it on the bus. I used to love the little bits of gossip you'd pick up on the bus. Fantastic. He did not, Bernie, did he? The louser. You should hear, he's no good for you, Bernie, I'm telling you. Now, there's the lovely customs house again. As I said, it's loaded with symbolism because until the late 19th century in this part of the world, most people never went to school. They couldn't read and write. They understood symbols. That's why churches used stained glass for centuries. The most important symbol on that building is over the main door and over every window. It's a triangle. It's to remind people of a very important fact. At the top of the triangle is God. And God's representatives on earth are the church and the royal family, or the rich. They rule. They have 90% of the wealth. That's the way God made the world. Your job is to live out your short, hard, miserable, poverty-stricken life, and you will get your reward in the next life, which is always good to know. That, folks, that is why so many people from Europe wanted to get over to the new world where they didn't have that old class system in place. Now, over on the left, a very important building in our economic history, 1987. Unemployment here is heading for 25%. We'd missed out on the Industrial Revolution and we were poorer than the rest of Western Europe. Then we had a good idea. That's a sentence I don't use too often, folks. The government had a good idea. Here's one I don't use even as often as that. The good idea worked. The International Financial Services Centre started bringing in banks from around the world. A few years later, we'd start bringing in tech companies from around the world. Now, the unemployment rate is 3.5%, and the number of people in Ireland with a job has gone from 1 million to 2.8 million. Many people say that's where the economic boom started. But Ireland is the only developed country in the world with a lower population than 180 years ago. It's mostly due to the 1840s potato famine and a century and a half of emigration that followed. If you want to find out more, you can visit the epic, award-winning Museum of Irish Emigration. Every person is connected. In fact, in modern world, it benefits Ireland to have around 70 million people of Irish descent living around the world. They were emigrating before the famine, but emigration went up by a factor of 10 to mostly in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Big Six. The Big Six was Britain, America and Canada, and then across the equator to Australia, New Zealand and La Repubblica de la Argentina, where to this day there's about 1 million people of Irish descent living, including a good friend of mine called Guillermo Emmanuel Jesus Brearte Calebron E. McLaughlin, editor of the Irish newspaper in Argentina. Over there on the left is the Jeannie Johnston, a replica built for the year 2000 of a famine-era ship. The only famine-era ship where nobody died. 16 transatlantic journeys, mostly back to Quebec City, Canada, where it was built. They never lost a passenger. Whereas on average, between 25 and 30% of passengers didn't make it across the Atlantic Ocean. Jeannie's open for tours every day between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. Now, we're just spinning the boat here. If you're on the left-hand side, there's a nice photograph of Dublin city centre skyline, Liberty Hall, the Millennium Spar, and the dome of the Customs House. Out to the right is the Docklands, where we're going to start heading now in a moment, on this boat called the Spirit of Docklands. I'm going to tell you that when I go past it in about 2 minutes. Yeah. So we're just doing a little pirouette. The Jeannie Johnston, as you can see, has no windows. Like most famine-era ships, it was a converted goods ship, never built originally for passengers. What it does have on each side is a very deliberate white pattern that was painted on many boats at the time to scare away pirates. That pattern out on the high seas makes it look like the boat is loaded with cannons or guns. And over there on the right, they're building a water sports centre. Yeah, right beside the river. That's a great idea. It's fantastic. It's a great thing about Dublin. No matter what small, tiny little parcel of land, somebody will come along and stick a building crane in the middle of it and turn it into a building site. Now there's the city centre if you're on the right hand side of the boat. So we're going to head down to the Docklands. Because of the railway bridge and a little bend in the river at the Customs House, if you stand at O'Connell Bridge today, you can't actually see this part of the city. So this used to be where all the boats were loaded and unloaded. And then in the early 1970s, a guy in America called Keith Tantlinger changed the world. Don't worry if you've never heard of Keith Tantlinger, because nobody has, unless you worked as a docker. Because he's the guy who cost hundreds of thousands of dockers around the world their jobs. He invented modern rectangular sealed containers to go on the boats, the trucks and lorries and the railway systems. It speeded up transport and trade around the world, but it wasn't good news if you were a docker, because they lost their jobs by the thousands. And this became a no-go area of Dublin with an unemployment rate of 75%. That's when the government came up with a good idea. That was in 1987. And our government is due to have another good idea fairly shortly. So yeah, this was a bit of a no-go area of Dublin, and people never came down here. And that's why this boat was purchased almost 20 years ago, the Spirit of the Docklands. Designed by a lad from Denmark and built by a boatyard across the water from Denmark in Sweden. So, Dublin began to change. Banks and a bit later tech companies came in. Another big change was the switch from houses to apartments. Almost immediately as Ireland became a wealthier country, something happened that happens in nearly all countries that get wealthier. The family size dropped. For some reason, the women didn't want to have 7 and 8 and 10 and 12 children anymore, and we started living in apartments. I was born in the 60s, and I don't remember any kids on our road, our estate, I don't remember any family with less than 4 or 5 kids. Some had 10 and 12. I was one of 7. I was the middle child of 7. I was the middle, neglected, overlooked, forgotten child, but it was years ago, and I'm over it now, and I hardly ever mention that anymore these days. Now, as I mentioned, we built 5 new bridges over the river in the last 25 years with the population going up. And this is another one of them. It's designed to remind you of Ireland's national symbol, which is a harp. I think we're the only country in the world whose national symbol is a musical instrument. It's named after Samuel Beckett, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969. And it's designed by a famous Spanish architect, I'm sure you've heard of him, called Dr. Santiago Calatrava de Joff. I hope you got that. Santiago Calatrava. He's known around the world, folks. He designed the Olympic Stadium in Athens, Greece, and he designed a building in Gothenburg, Sweden, which looks like a man stretching as he gets out of bed. Fantastic piece of architecture. Speaking of good architecture, this building on the left, this is something Dublin badly needed. It's almost 20 years old now, and it's our National Convention Centre. Brings in conferences and conventions from around Europe and around the world. The man who designed it was Irish-born architect Kevin Roche. His big maxim in life was never retire. If you're doing a job you love, folks, don't retire. 2 years ago, Kevin Roche retired. 3 months after he retired, Kevin Roche died. Let that be a lesson to you, folks. He died at 98 years of age, in fairness, but still. Now, as a golden rule down here, any old building has been knocked down and replaced by modern buildings, all the old warehouses. But there's two on the left which were not knocked down. The first was the wool exchange. The price of wool was agreed by merchants there before it was exported from Ireland. The wool market in Ireland collapsed in the middle of the 19th century. It became cheaper to import wool from Australia on the far side of the world. 100 years later, the wool market in Ireland was revived, would you believe, by World War II. They didn't have enough wool for the soldiers. Warm clothes, so Ireland revived its wool market. And the second building, the red building with the green dome on top, that was a hotel where 1.1 million people spent their last night before emigrating from a much poorer Ireland. The last big group to stay there in the 1950s were heading out to Australia and New Zealand after World War II. The black and white boat on the river is a tender, which took passengers out to the deep sea liners between the late 19th and mid 20th century. In April 1912, that tender serviced a brand new liner off the southwest coast of Ireland. It only got to service it once because the liner was called the Titanic. Over there on the left in gold, a building which kind of symbolises how much Ireland has changed. That's the new Central Bank of Ireland. They have a problem. Well, they had a problem. They kind of solved it at the end of the year. A budget surplus of 28 billion euros for the year. But thankfully we had a general election yesterday and the government came up with a nice way to blow it in the budget, to invest it wisely for future generations.